Hi, I'm Chris Germer. I'm a clinical psychologist and a co-developer of the 8-week Mindful Self-Compassion training program. And I'm also on the organizing committee of the Self-Compassion in Psychotherapy certificate program of the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. I really appreciate your interest in compassion in therapy, this particular summit, and also for spending your precious time exploring this topic. Although compassion in psychotherapy is as old as therapy itself, it's only quite recently that our field is galvanizing itself around compassion as a fundamental resource for alleviating suffering. A resource that's innate, yet it can be cultivated during therapy and also between sessions, just like mindfulness. The Awake Network has assembled a stellar panel of speakers, and I'm so honored to be part of the panel and also thrilled to be taking part in the conversation. So my job is to provide a panoramic, mostly scientific overview of compassion-based psychotherapy. So there's a lot here. Please hang on to your hat. This talk focuses on self-compassion because the main goal of compassion-based therapy is for the client to become more self-compassionate. However, the research is clear that compassion for others increases self-compassion and self-compassion increases compassion for others. So the way for clients to become more self-compassionate is for therapists to suffuse every aspect of psychotherapy with compassion. But compassion alone actually is not enough. Marsha Linehan once quipped, what good is compassion if it doesn't actually help? So we need wisdom too. In psychotherapy, wisdom is clinical wisdom. It's our accumulated understanding gleaned from clinical practice and also from clinical science. So in this talk, what I'd like to do is to put compassion-based therapy in its historical context. I'd like to discuss some key mechanisms of change in compassion-based therapy. And I'd also like to describe 3 broad ways that any therapist can integrate self-compassion into their work. My comments in this talk are based on a review of the current scientific literature on self-compassion in psychotherapy, actually over 350 articles. And it's also based on a few decades of clinical practice, mostly the last 10 to 15 years since I learned about self-compassion and have been developing and teaching the 8-week Mindful Self-Compassion program along with Kristen Neff and colleagues from around the world. So first, I'd like to briefly share how I became interested in self-compassion. For most of my professional career, I've been working closely with colleagues at the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy in Cambridge, Massachusetts, exploring how to integrate mindfulness into therapy. And after we wrote an edited book in 2005, it was called Mindfulness in Psychotherapy, I felt obliged to do more public speaking, which brought to a head my 20-year history with public speaking anxiety. Technically, throughout this whole time, I was an expert in anxiety disorders as a clinician, and I even wrote a dissertation on anxiety in 1984, but actually nothing in my clinical toolbox, including mindfulness, seemed to alleviate my public speaking anxiety. But at any rate, eventually in desperation, I learned loving kindness meditation on a retreat, especially loving kindness for myself. And then 4 months later, I basically was able to stand in front of a large audience at a Harvard Medical School conference and deliver a speech with only a minimum of panic and dread. So I'm not going to bore you with the details of this experience, but I would like to say what it was about this experience that was revealed to me, in particular, the unique nature of self-compassion. And so what I learned is that actually self-compassion and mindfulness are very complementary. Kristen and I like to say they're best friends forever, BFF. And on an absolute level, when compassion or mindfulness is in full bloom, they're really indistinguishable. However, when we're suffering a lot and we're really probably not very mindful or compassionate, it's helpful to see the differences between mindfulness and self-compassion. So in particular, I learned that mindfulness is really about loving awareness of moment-to-moment experience, whereas self-compassion is loving awareness of the experiencer, the person. It's very personal. Compassion is personal. And when we're in the grip of intense and disturbing emotions, such as shame or despair or grief, we often need to hold ourselves before we can hold our experience. We need to give loving awareness to ourselves before we can bring loving awareness to our experience. So I discovered that self-compassion is a necessary complement to mindfulness, especially in psychotherapy, where people bring us their most difficult emotional challenges. I also learned at the time that my public speaking anxiety was actually not an anxiety disorder, that it was a shame disorder. You know, here I was trying to talk about mindfulness, and I was so nervous I could hardly speak, so that's kind of a shameful thing. I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to look like a fraud or stupid or incompetent. It was a shame disorder. And I wasn't actually able to see that or address that. But once I started practicing self-compassion, my shame started to reduce even before I knew that it was a shame problem. So now I'm writing a book on self-compassion for shame. 15 years after this initial epiphany, But that's a tougher nut to crack, to relate to shame with self-compassion. That's the best way to relate to shame, but it takes a little while longer. Anyhow, a few years later, after this experience, I met Kristen Neff in 2008, and she had operationalized self-compassion and also created the self-compassion scale. And you'll be hearing from Kristen in the summit. And that scale is used in most of the research, and we've been working together ever since, along with a community of teachers, self-compassion teachers around the world, to explore and to share self-compassion practice. I also had the privilege of meeting and learning from other notables in the field, such as Paul Gilbert, who you'll be hearing from, and Dick Schwartz, also in this summit. And I also met many colleagues around the world who are working in the field of compassion-based psychotherapy. So it's been just a fabulous journey. So to say a few things about the history of self-compassion, self-compassion is all the rage now, but it's really not new. Both Kristen and I learned about self-compassion from our Buddhist meditation teachers. In Buddhist psychology, compassion for oneself is really considered the foundation of compassion for others. It's pretty much the same thing in Christianity, love your neighbor as yourself. The idea is that we know how to love ourselves, and we can just expand that to others. Ironically, the research shows now, in modern times, that people are actually more compassionate toward others than toward themselves. So rather than starting with self-compassion as a basis for how we can treat others, we now use how we treat others as a basis for learning how to be compassionate toward ourselves. In other words, to basically return home. We've been orphaned for a long time. Self-compassion is also not new to psychotherapy. It's been part of therapy for over a century, but it's been under the umbrella of self-acceptance. So psychotherapy giants like William James and Sigmund Freud and B.F. Skinner, they all considered acceptance of oneself and others to be psychologically beneficial. Carl Rogers in 1951 and afterwards other humanistic therapists elevated self-compassion to the status of a core practice in psychotherapy. And then an interesting thing happened in the 1990s. Clinical research shifted away from acceptance of the self to acceptance of moment-to-moment experience with the introduction of Buddhist-inspired mindfulness and acceptance-based treatments, such as dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. But in the last 10 years, mostly, the pendulum has begun to swing back again. So now, including both acceptance of moment-to-moment experience or mindfulness and also of the experiencer, that's compassion, acceptance of the self, not being shy to give this fiction called the self the love that it needs when it's struggling. So we could say actually that research on mindfulness has had about a 20-year jump on self-compassion, but that's fine because mindfulness is really the foundation of compassion practice. We have to know that we're struggling in order to be able to offer ourselves a compassionate response. For most of the history of psychotherapy, the term compassion has been basically absent from the research literature. However, that doesn't mean that compassion wasn't there. Compassion actually has been implied in the definition of empathy. So empathy refers to experiencing the world of another person as one's own. A modern definition of compassion is quite multidimensional. It includes empathy, so it has 4 parts. Number 1, an awareness of suffering, cognitive awareness and emotional awareness. Number 2, sympathetic concern. That means to be moved by the suffering. So both of that is empathy. But it also has the wish to see relief from that suffering, as well as a responsiveness or readiness to relieve the suffering. So compassion technically has 4 components: seeing pain, feeling pain, wishing for relief, and also doing something about it if we can. And the wish and the readiness to help is really the quality of goodwill. So when we take empathy and we add goodwill, then we have compassion. So since really the premise of psychotherapy is goodwill, in other words, why do we do this? We're trying to alleviate people's distress. We can really assume that compassion has really been in psychotherapy for a long time under the banner of empathy. And empathy also has a solid place in psychotherapy research. A meta-analysis with thousands of studies has shown that empathy is a key ingredient in effective therapy relationships. So right now, we have a new paradigm of psychotherapy emerging. Most of you are probably aware of it. It's called mindfulness, acceptance, and compassion-based therapy. So in the CBT tradition, this approach is called third wave therapy. And within this paradigm, some therapists focus more on mindfulness, others on acceptance, and still others on compassion as the target or the primary mechanism of change in treatment. So mindfulness-based clinicians, they tend to emphasize the role of attention and awareness in how we create and alleviate emotional suffering. Acceptance-based clinicians, they focus more on non-avoidance and acceptance of moment-to-moment experience, but now they're also including acceptance of oneself, self-compassion. And they're also less likely than mindfulness-based therapists to prescribe meditation. Compassion-based therapies focus primarily on emotion regulation, and not regulating emotion through attention and awareness, but more through care and connection. So these are fine differences, but these approaches really, they have more in common than not, especially in actual practice. So what is self-compassion? So Kristen is going to say a whole lot more of this on day 2 of this summit. But I'd like to say just a few things about self-compassion so that we're all on the same page. An informal definition of self-compassion is treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding as we'd treat a dear friend when things go wrong. So, very simply, self-compassion is a U-turn. And some people worry, oh, isn't this selfish, self-indulgent? But actually, self-compassion is a humble enterprise. What we're doing is we're simply including ourselves in the circle of compassion. One can even make an argument that it's more selfish to systematically exclude ourselves because we're focused on ourselves so much. Anyhow, this U-turn is helpful for clients too. So if you have a client who wants to be more self-compassionate and is going through a tough time, as a therapist, if you said this very simple thing to your client, often it kind of opens doors, and that is, how would you treat a dear friend in this situation? What would you say? What would you do? I once had a traumatized, person who was severely traumatized in childhood as a client who was burning herself with cigarettes. And at some point I said, what would you say to a dear friend who just told you that she was burning herself with cigarettes? And this client was just brilliant. She said, oh, I would feel so sad for her. I tell her that I know that she's probably in more pain than she's able to say, and that I want to be there for her. I was awestruck, because these are the kinds of things that I wanted to say, but she couldn't receive from me, But she could have these feelings and thoughts toward someone else. And so that activated the compassion in her. And then our job was simply to begin to offer that same kindness to herself. And over the next few years, she did it. Basically, she was able to manage her emotional pain with compassion rather than with more pain, harming herself with physical pain in order to feel less emotional pain. So this is a powerful mechanism, this informal definition. Kristen has a really brilliant formal definition, which consists of 3 components: self-kindness rather than self-criticism, common humanity rather than isolation, and mindfulness rather than over-identification or rumination. So that's self-compassion. And it appears to be an underlying change process in psychotherapy. In other words, it's possible that no matter whom you treat, how you treat the person, or what you're treating them for, that if they develop self-compassion, that it's going to be good for them, right? And the research also on correlational research on self-compassion and mental health is super clear that self-compassion is good for mental health and psychological well-being. But just think about this. Imagine that as a therapist, you have a client who is suffering from anxiety or depression. And during therapy, whether it's 10 sessions or 10 years, your client becomes deeply compassionate toward herself. Imagine this. Depressed client, anxious client, deeply compassionate toward herself. And this means, following Kristen's model, that when things go wrong in her life, your client can, number 1, recognize and validate for herself how she feels. Like, oh, this hurts, rather than getting lost in rumination. So that's mindfulness. And when she's struggling, she feels connected to other people in the midst of her struggles rather than feeling alone or ashamed. Connected. That's common humanity. And imagine that you're the same client, that her internal conversation, like when she's anxious or depressed, her internal conversation is mostly comforting and supporting, the same way you probably speak to your client, rather than self-critical. So that's the component of self-kindness. When a client has these mental habits, there's a really good chance that your client's symptoms would have already subsided and she probably doesn't need that much therapy anymore, even though the challenges of life will remain. But now she has this resource to actually meet these challenges, right? She can validate what's happening, she doesn't feel so alone, and she is supportive and kind to herself. This is magic. This is what we're talking about with self-compassion and psychotherapy. The research evidence indicates that self-compassion is what we call a transdiagnostic mechanism of change. That is, it improves mental health across the board in clinical populations. So, as I mentioned, self-compassion is strongly associated with mental health in correlational studies. So high self-compassion has been associated with less OCD, less suicidality, less shame, fewer eating disorders, even fewer symptoms in schizophrenia, and lower psychopathology in general. And low self-compassion has been associated with more generalized anxiety, depression, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder. Even low self-compassion has even been associated with persecutory delusions. In the research, compassion-based therapy, actually delivering therapy, especially compassion-focused therapy, has been shown to be helpful for anxiety, depression, social anxiety, eating disorders, addictions, personality disorders, and even psychotic disorders. So, and by the way, these studies, they're not always well controlled, but meta-analyses of the good studies have actually shown moderate to strong effect sizes for compassion-based treatment compared to controls, including compassion-based treatment when compared to active controls. That's the tough one in outcome research. These are when the comparison group is actually a real treatment, not just being on the waiting list. And compassion-based treatments have actually been shown in a meta-analysis to be more effective than active controls. So the empirical evidence also indicates that self-compassion increases in clients who are in different kinds of therapy: psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, humanistic, third wave, which suggests that self-compassion is also a trans-theoretical change process. So for example, Shanch and colleagues found that both psychodynamic and cognitive therapy for cluster 3 personality disorders, like avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorders, those 2 treatments increased self-compassion, and self-compassion predicted decreases in psychiatric symptoms, interpersonal problems, and personality pathology in both approaches. So similar increases in self-compassion and reductions in symptoms were also found in other kinds of therapy in the literature. So the question is, how does self-compassion work? So what's going on as people get better in therapy and self-compassion increases? So in the research literature, self-compassion is most closely related to emotion regulation. And emotion regulation refers to the ability to attend to, appraise, and modulate the intensity and duration of emotional states. So trauma treatment really illustrates the role of self-compassion in emotion regulation. So research actually shows that most people who experience trauma do not develop PTSD. How trauma survivors regulate challenging emotions statistically predicts PTSD better than the severity of trauma exposure. PTSD is actually maintained, and this is all in the research, by experiential avoidance. or non-exposure by avoiding what it is that we're afraid of. The research also shows that self-compassion reduces avoidance. It helps people to acknowledge and to accept their feelings. Self-compassion also calms the nervous system. It reduces shame, and shame is often associated with trauma. In fact, shame sustains trauma, and shame is the opposite of self-compassion. It reduces shame, and it also increases a sense of safeness, which is the opposite of hypervigilance in post-traumatic stress disorder. So therefore, self-compassion can be described as a buffer or a way of regulating traumatic memories and emotions so that they don't become chronic problems. And in a systematic review of the literature on self-compassion, trauma, and PTSD, increased self-compassion was consistently associated with reduced post-traumatic stress disorder. And research also shows that self-compassion reduces the effect of trauma among people who have had childhood abuse and neglect. That's a tough group, as well as women with severe and repeated interpersonal trauma. In other words, it gets deep. And self-compassion has also been associated with a greater post-traumatic growth and healing. So just like in Kristen's model, it's on the one hand, there's an increase in self-kindness and a decrease in self-criticism, an increase in common humanity along with a decrease in isolation, an increase in mindfulness along with a decrease in over-identification. So we actually see positive things happening at the same time as we seeing negative things. And self-compassion and compassion itself is ultimately a positive emotion. So this is a strength-based approach to trauma, or to, frankly, psychotherapy. So then the question is, how specifically does self-compassion help with emotion regulation? So physiologically, increases in self-compassion are associated with changes in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system directs the body's response to dangerous or stressful situations, and the parasympathetic nervous system allows the body to rest and relax following sympathetic arousal. People with high trait self-compassion, in other words, those who score high on Kristen's scale, have more parasympathetic activity. That is the relaxation response. And it's measured by what's called vaguely mediated heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is maybe considered a measure of soothing and safeness, often associated with social cues like a calm voice or a gentle touch. Paul Gilbert notes that actually most therapies help clients to manage challenges arising from an overactive threat system, or sometimes an overactive drive system. But compassion actually shifts our physiology into contentment, soothing, and social safeness. And that is the physiology of enhanced heart rate variability. So if you want to increase your parasympathetic nervous system with self-compassion, there's one study that found that speaking to yourself in a soothing and compassionate manner while looking in the mirror increased heart rate variability as well as positive emotions. But looking at yourself in the mirror without saying kind things to yourself, or saying kind things to yourself without looking in the mirror, were not as effective as looking in the mirror and talking to yourself in a soothing and compassionate way. So anybody can do this. Anybody who's listening, like after this talk, go do it. See what happens. Neurologically, we're talking about mechanisms of emotion regulation. Neurologically, we've seen in brain imaging studies at least 2 areas associated with self-compassion. And that's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And these areas are commonly associated with executive functioning and emotion regulation, especially downregulating the amygdala and the threat system. So psychologically, the psychological construct most commonly associated with self-compassion is secure attachment. So self-compassion is shaped by a person's attachment history. Since children internalize how they're treated, and if they received comfort and support from primary caregivers when they were in distress, they'll probably do the same thing for themselves later in life. That's self-compassion. In the research, insecure attachment is consistently associated with lower levels of self-compassion. Parental rejection, criticism, overprotection, and stressful family relationships are negatively related to self-compassion. And conversely, early memories of warmth and safeness have been positively linked to self-compassion in the literature. There's also evidence that people with insecure attachment feel threatened by compassion. This is really important for clinicians to know about, and Paul Gilbert made a self-report scale called the Fears of Compassion scale to measure this. So fears of compassion are patterns of avoidance that keep a person from benefiting from compassion. And fear of compassion is consistently associated with mental health difficulties. So, compassion is an antidote to suffering. It's been with us since the dawn of human beings on this planet. But it's only an effective antidote if we actually take the medicine. But if we have an instinctive aversion to compassion, we can't take the medicine. We actually can't heal in a natural way. So the main reason for fear of compassion is when positive emotions arise in relationship to others, and then they trigger painful childhood memories of rejection or harm. So this is especially likely when, as a child, for example, a person, the child in distress turns to the caregivers for care and comfort, but is rejected or feels hurt in some way. And then what the child learns is, when I start to do that, seek love and compassion or allow love and compassion into my life, they start to remember how they were rejected. And so this naturally will create fear. So in the mindful self-compassion training, we actually call this backdraft, the actual distress that arises when people give themselves compassion. It's part of the way of working with backdraft is to know that doesn't mean that you're failing in compassion. It's an intrinsic part of the process. So backdraft can take the form of thoughts and beliefs. So if we have a lingering thought, I'm unlovable, when we start to get close to somebody, boom, we might start to feel that way, This is why sometimes in relationships, it's the most beautiful relationships that we kind of sabotage. Why are we doing this? It's because we actually are getting overwhelmed by negative experiences in the context of the goodness, the love that we're experiencing in the relationship. It all makes sense. It's paradoxical, but it makes sense, and therapists need to know about this if you want to work with compassion. So backdraft can take the form of thoughts and beliefs, such as I'm unlovable, emotions, such as grief or shame, body memories, aches and pains, and also automatic behaviors, such as withdrawal or aggression. This can all be instinctive ways of, things that we've experienced and how we've reacted, and that will come out in the therapy room when a person is beginning to actually let in the compassion. So backdraft is an intrinsic part of the transformation process in compassion-based therapy. Because compassion is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it will activate old memories and make them available for reprocessing. But on the other hand, it's an opportunity. Compassion is an opportunity to receive the kindness and understanding that was probably lacking when the painful experiences originally occurred. And as the resource of, just let me say that part of most compassion-based trainings to learn how to work with backdraft. It's too big a subject for me to talk about now. But as the resource of self-compassion develops, and it does, it gets much stronger than the backdraft, clients feel safer within themselves, and they develop a secure base from which to explore the inner and the outer world. So working effectively with backdraft, compassion-based therapy can be understood as a process of reparenting. Okay, so moving from insecure attachment to secure attachment is the process of reparenting by transforming and reprocessing the experiences of wounds, early childhood relational wounds. Okay, so we're talking about different psychological mechanisms underlying self-compassion psychotherapy. The alleviation of shame is another mechanism by which self-compassion appears to work in psychotherapy. So what's shame? Shame is a self-conscious emotion characterized by negative self-evaluation. So Helen Block Lewis in 1987, she said that shame is one's own vicarious experience of the other's scorn. So shame means I'm imagining in my mind what you are imagining about me, and it's not good. Okay? So shame has a long history as a predisposing factor in psychopathology associated with a broad spectrum of disorders like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, PTSD, substance abuse. And many studies have shown that self-compassion and shame are inversely associated. In fact, Kristen Neff's 3 components, the opposite are a sense of self-criticism, isolation, and rumination. These are actually qualities of shame, right? And in the clinical arena, self-compassion is associated with lower levels of shame and psychological distress in people with depression, eating disorders, body image problems, stress related to fertility, HIV, sexual minority stigma, parenting, caregiving. So shame is actually becoming a target for psychological interventions, especially with the emergence of compassion-based treatments. Paul Gilbert, when he created compassion-focused therapy, he was actually looking for a way of working with self-criticism and shame. And he nailed it. Because if self-compassion is nothing else, it's an antidote to shame. So now, the last part is how do we integrate self-compassion into psychotherapy? So this Awake Network Summit is actually organized along 3 levels of integration: the compassionate therapist, compassion in the therapeutic relationship, and clinical applications of compassion. So in the research literature, these 3 levels, they correspond to therapeutic presence, which is how therapists relate to themselves and their own inner experience of a client during a session. The therapeutic alliance, which is how therapists engage with their clients, verbally and non-verbally, and also therapeutic interventions, which is how clients relate to themselves, especially during home practice. So you're going to hear different speakers on each of these topics over the next few days. And as we all know, by the way, different therapy approaches emphasize each of these 3 levels to differing degrees. So for example, in psychodynamic psychotherapy, the relationship is everything. The relationship is the intervention. And in CBT, more directive interventions like home practices have greater priority. But what's interesting, in real life, it appears that most therapists work with all 3 levels. So you may have heard of the smuggling hypothesis. Naturalistic research has shown that psychodynamic therapists frequently include CBT interventions in their treatment, and when they do, it enhances both the therapeutic alliance and treatment outcomes. Research has also shown that when there is a strong alliance, that adherence to a treatment manual really does not impact outcome. Whereas when there's a weak alliance, then more adherence to a manual was required to get good outcomes. There are two psychologists, Jeremy Safran and John Murin. They wrote that treatment methods are relational acts. So we have these three levels, but we really need to look at these levels as integrated. Okay? So level number one, compassionate presence. So in compassion-based therapy, the personhood of the therapist's presence, is really the basis of the whole therapy enterprise. We have a saying in the MSc program, the way to teach self-compassion is to be compassionate. And being compassionate is not very hard for therapists. You know, we're kind of a self-selective group. I think everyone who's a therapist has been asked sometime in their lives by friends or family saying, how can you possibly listen to people telling their troubles to you all day long, day in and day out, you know? And we kind of scratch our heads because we're actually kind of energized by it. So how do we do this? The secret is compassion, you know? Compassion turns suffering into something positive. Compassion is a positive emotion. It turns suffering into something positive through the alchemy of kindness and common humanity. And this is our daily experience as therapists, you know? I mean, at some point we can definitely get worn out and then we need a lot of self-compassion. Presence. So the term presence is closely related to mindfulness. Current research shows that there is actually a positive relationship between therapist mindfulness and the therapy alliance. But there's a less reliable association between therapist mindfulness and treatment outcome. So it really does appear that presence alone is probably not enough for effective treatment. We need other aspects. We need these other two levels, in my view. And there are two researchers, Borgalt and Dion, who found that self-compassion is clearly linked to therapeutic presence. If you cultivate self-compassion as a therapist, there's a very good chance that it will enhance your therapeutic presence. And the authors speculate that self-compassion works by enhancing presence in three ways. Number one, presence with oneself, by reducing self-criticism. Isn't it so that therapists are kind of self-critical, you know? Look at any New Yorker cartoon. By reducing self-criticism and enhancing self-kindness, we are more present. It also enhances presence with the client by, as I mentioned before, increasing compassion for others. And it enhances presence in the therapy relationship by an increasing sense of common humanity, and also lowering reactivity to relational difficulties. So there are many legitimate reasons why a clinician might not be present during therapy. For example, you know, listening to a client's traumatic experience could trigger a similar experience in us, and then we're off to the races, you know, swept away. Maybe it's just too distressing to hear what a client is saying, or your fifth client of the day. And so you just, you know, zone out, space out. I mean, we all know what this is like. Maybe it's just the wrong time of day, you know, like 3 PM, you want to take a nap or something, I don't know. But anyhow, these lapses in presence are not a problem as long as therapists can find their way back into compassionate presence. And research suggests that loving kindness and compassion meditation, these two meditations, loving kindness and compassion, can help to enhance empathy and restore therapeutic presence. So I've recorded 2 meditations for this summit to cultivate compassionate presence. And you can practice these meditations both on the cushion in personal meditation or in the therapy office. And those meditations are affectionate breathing and giving and receiving compassion. The second level of integration of self-compassion into psychotherapy is the compassionate alliance. So Sigmund Freud, back in 1927, was the first to recognize that a positive therapy relationship is necessary for the difficult work of therapy. We need help to deal with what's coming up in therapy. And almost 50 years later, Edward Borden proposed the therapeutic alliance as a common factor in effective therapy. Sherry Geller, who's speaking on the third day of this summit, will tell you a lot more about the therapeutic alliance. She's an expert in presence and the therapeutic alliance. Research also shows that the therapeutic alliance is a robust predictor of therapy outcome across many different kinds of therapy. It's a common factor. And meta-analyses of psychotherapy outcome highlight the importance of compassion in the therapy alliance. Remember, I said that actually what we understand as empathy in psychotherapy is really compassion. So Bohart and some colleagues in 2002 determined in their meta-analysis that empathy accounts for more outcome variance than treatment interventions do. Okay? Empathy is a common factor. Therapists who score higher on interpersonal skills such as empathy and warmth have better treatment outcome. Probably no surprise there. Research has found that successful therapists tend to be warmer, more empathic, understanding and supportive of their clients, and also less likely to blame, ignore, neglect, or reject their clients. They have better outcomes. The problem is that, we have to be able to figure out how to sustain compassion in psychotherapy, not actually do those things, because we do them sometimes, blame, reject, so that's where practice comes in. So how do we actually create or sustain a compassionate therapeutic relationship? So this is a really rich conversation that I think actually each of the speakers in this summit will have a lot to say about. My own approach comes from the Mindful Self-Compassion program, particularly the inquiry method in MSc, but also in mindfulness training, as applied to clinical practice. So we like to say that there are 3 R's of a compassionate therapeutic relationship. The first is radical acceptance, and that's the overall attitude of the relationship. The second is resonance, which is the mode of engagement. And the third is resource building, which is the desired outcome of the relationship. And in this case, the resource would be emotion regulation through self-compassion. So I'll take each of these at a time. Radical acceptance. So Marsha Linehan, she first coined radical acceptance as an attitude that therapists need to adopt toward their clients with borderline personality disorder in order to keep them engaged and working in therapy. If a therapist has even a slightly shaming attitude toward BPD client, they're out the door. She got that. And she, in her language, radical acceptance is being fully open to what is, entering into the reality just as it is in this moment. Acceptance without the haze of what one wants or doesn't want it to be. That's an amazing thing. Imagine you can be with our client without looking through the haze of what you want this person to be or not be, right? So it's an ideal. It's not something we do all the time. And radical acceptance also doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior or being complacent in the face of social injustice. It means to abandon the fight against our inner experience as it arises in the present moment. And radical acceptance is also a tall order because it actually refers to friendship with difficult emotions. It's not just about making space for difficult emotions. It's actually friendship. So you know what this is like. Consider how much better it feels when, say, you're angry and your anger is embraced rather than just endured. Or imagine that your vulnerability is welcomed rather than just tolerated. Or imagine you have trauma and your trauma is honored rather than just acknowledged. This is radical acceptance. And radical acceptance, so we can do this as therapists, but radical acceptance by clients means they can do this for themselves. So as we know from DBT, there is a dialectic between this radical acceptance and change. The goal of compassion-based therapy is definitely to alleviate suffering, but the question is, how do we do it? Do we do it by resisting and avoiding what's happening in the present moment? Or what Bob Sharples in Australia calls the subtle aggression of self-improvement, which usually just makes suffering persist or amplify? Or do we do it by accepting what is happening in this moment and accepting ourselves? So the central paradox of self-compassion is, and this is rather amazing for therapists to keep in mind, when we suffer, we practice self-compassion not to feel better, but simply because we feel bad. So the challenge is to temporarily suspend the change agenda and allow kindness to flow as a natural response to suffering. And when we do that, that's a platform for change. Carl Rogers once said, the curious paradox is the more I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. So this is radical acceptance. So it's really good for therapists to have this attitude in their head if they want to have a compassionate relationship. The second R is resonance. And this is the primary mode of engagement in a therapeutic relationship. And it refers to Dan Siegel's expression, feeling felt. Dan is going to talk about this on day 3 of the summit. Feeling felt. We want our clients to be able to say, I know that you know how I feel. That's magic, And Daniel Stern, it's affective attunement. Daniel Stern defined affective attunement as the performance of behaviors that express the quality of feeling of a shared affect state without imitating the exact behavioral expression of that state. So attunement between a parent and a child is a necessary precondition for healthy emotional attachment. But when attachment is lacking in childhood, it can be learned in psychotherapy through resonance. So on a practical level, how might a therapist maintain resonance while being actively engaged with a client? Because it's easy to do when we're just listening. But what if we, have to talk? How do you do this? So in the MSc program, we talk about the pings, following the pings. And we can do this in therapy. So a ping is a moment of salience that a therapist experiences in her or his body, or kind of what stands out while the client is talking. Usually it's an emotion like sadness or fear or relief or awe. And when it's the therapist's chance to talk, the therapist can share from her or his embodied experience what was felt in a validating manner. So for example, if a client, a therapist can say to a client, when you spoke about how angry you were toward your son, I felt sad because I know how important it is for you to have a close relationship with your son. So rather than, the client's angry and you start figuring out how to solve some problem, you stay in touch with what you're feeling. Isn't it interesting? I'm feeling sad as my client is getting angry. And then speaking from your heart. So you're listening with your heart and you're speaking from your heart. That's called speaking from pings. And Carl Rogers actually noted that empathy in therapy is not simply sharing all the time the experiences of the client. That's actually a misunderstanding about him. But he calls it sensing meanings of which the client is scarcely aware. So this is the practice of listening and speaking from embodied experience rather than getting caught up in our thoughts and having intellectual conversations, which is actually often a relief to do when there's pain in the room, but maybe not so helpful. So the third R is resource building. And this is the desired outcome of therapy. In compassion-based therapy, the desired outcome, as I mentioned before, is emotion regulation by cultivating the resource of self-compassion. And to build resources, the therapist can ask the client to share precisely, clearly, what she or he experienced and also how she or he responded to it. So it's the response that helps us to shape the resource. So for example, in the little vignette I gave before, if the client acknowledged that he was actually sad about fighting with his son, then the therapist could follow up by saying something like, and how do you care for yourself when you're sad? Or right now, what do you think you need when you feel sad like this? Or if you have a friend in the same situation, what might you say to your friend heart to heart? So all these questions, they direct the client to explore how she or he could compassionately respond to emotional pain, and thereby building the resource of self-compassion in the therapy relationship itself before we even get to home practices. Okay, so those are the 3 R's. They're all part of level 2, which is the therapeutic alliance. And now I'd just like to mention briefly level 3, which is compassionate interventions. That's all we got left to say in this talk. So an intervention in psychotherapy is broadly described as an action taken to bring about a positive change in a client or a patient. And in the current discussion, we're talking only about directive interventions because we were just speaking in the context of the therapeutic alliance and also presence about when the intervention is the relationship. And there are a wealth of practices that clinicians can customize for individual clients to cultivate self-compassion. So for example, in the MSc program, there are 7 formal meditations, 20 informal practices, both mindfulness and self-compassion, and 14 class exercises that can be built into home practices. There's a lot to choose from, and it's written in books and stuff. Compassion-focused therapy also provides a range of compassion and self-compassion practices from 4 general areas. Developing an inner compassionate self, compassion flowing out to others, compassion flowing into oneself, and also giving compassion to oneself. So to develop this state of mind of compassion, there are many different directions and ways of doing this. And Paul will surely share that as well. Also, there are a lot of workbooks on practices which therapists can actually use as an adjunct to therapy. And also, compassion can be added to traditional CBT interventions. So for example, if somebody wants to do exposure therapy for agoraphobia, you can actually practice intentional self-compassionate, self-soothing practices during exposure to make it more tolerable. Rather than just enduring exposure, warm it up. Similarly, like for behavioral activation for depression, such as scheduling enjoyable activities, behavioral activation can be accompanied by a practice to motivate oneself with words of encouragement, rather than forcing oneself to do things like, oh, I'm supposed to do this for my depression, to motivate oneself with kindness to do things. So these are ways that self-compassion can be integrated into existing treatments. Generally speaking, there are 2 questions which lead directly to self-compassion interventions. One is, what do I need? And the other we've already mentioned, which is, how do I treat a friend? So sometimes when people ask themselves this question, which by the way, just to ask the question is a huge act of self-kindness. But when they ask themselves the question, they actually don't know the answer. So then we need to get more specific. And you can do this as a therapist. You can say to a client, what do you need to feel safe? What do you need to comfort yourself emotionally? What would help you to soothe yourself physically? What do you need to do right now to protect yourself? How could you best provide for yourself? What would you say to yourself to best motivate yourself in this situation? So what do I need? That's a really wonderful guide. And just in terms of co-creating interventions, interventions should always be built on the foundation of therapeutic presence and the therapeutic alliance. So non-compliance with directive interventions doesn't mean the end of compassion-based therapy. It's simply an invitation to back up and to collaborate more meaningfully in the process of designing home practices. So some clients entirely refuse to do home practices, and that simply means that therapists need to focus on enhancing self-compassion through compassionate presence and through the compassionate alliance until their clients might be motivated to practice on their own. Some clients never want to practice on their own. They want to be nourished in the relationship, and that too will teach self-compassion. A really helpful challenge for therapists who want to design home practice for their clients is to do so without ever mentioning self-compassion. And that's because striving to be more self-compassionate can be demoralizing, especially for clients who are low in self-compassion. So ideally, interventions should be co-created with clients based on what transpired in the session. So rather than teaching self-compassion, clinicians can help their clients to notice emotional pain in the here and now, to recognize ways that they may not be alone, and to respond with kindness as they would to a good friend. So a client is way more likely to follow a treatment recommendation, home practice, when the practice is a genuine relief and when it has meaning based on what occurred in the therapy session. So anyhow, there you have it. Maybe I can just say, finally, that self-compassion-based therapy is really in its adolescence. Compared to mindfulness-based therapy and other forms of therapy, the empirical base, research base, is rapidly expanding, and it's very promising. But there are still relatively few well-controlled therapy outcome studies that target self-compassion. Which means if anybody who's listening to this wants to explore how to bring compassion into their particular field of expertise, you own it. But there's a lot of indirect evidence for the importance of self-compassion in therapy. It's quite robust, such as numerous studies on self-compassion as a mediator or a cause of positive therapy outcomes, and also lots of correlational studies consistently showing a close association between self-compassion, mental health, secure attachment, and reduced shame. And so therefore, ongoing efforts by clinical scientists and practitioners such as yourselves will inevitably deepen our understanding of how self-compassion works in therapy, and also enhance the effectiveness of treatments for a broad range of psychological conditions and diverse populations. I know this talk went on a lot longer than I planned. Thank you so much for your attention, and I do hope our paths cross in the future. Thank you so much.